This has to do with Parshas Matos. We find that that a daughter inherits if there's no son. So we find that when was that introduced? With the B'dos Tzlavchod. Tzlavchod only had daughters, and they had come and they said, we deserve a portion of our father. And Moshe didn't know the halacha. And he asked Hashem, and Hashem says, the daughters of Tzlavchod are correct, they deserve a portion. And the daughter's an heir if there's no son. So the laws of inheritance came about through the daughters of Tzlavchod. So Rashi over there cites the Chazal that it was the Saldi min halacha, that this halacha was not known to Moshe Rabbeinu. It had to come through the no Tzlavchod. Why? Because originally, when it happened with Yisro, when Yisro originally had advised Moshe Rabbeinu that the way he's going about to adjudicate the various disputes, he's doing it the wrong way. He should set up a hierarchy among the courts. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, "Hadover akosher teviyun Eli." What's most difficult to bring to me, that itself to Hashem was unacceptable. It was tinged slightly that he is more qualified than they are, the way he said it. So therefore Hashem says, I'll show you that there's going to be a halacha, a question can be presented to you, and you're not going to be able to respond. And that was the story with the daughters of Tzlavchod. So the daughters of Tzlavchod, rather than the law being communicated directly through Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem caused them to forget, not to know, and only it came through the daughters of Tzlavchod. Their marriage comes from them. Because Moshe Rabbeinu said, Hadovar koshet teviyun Eli. What's most of what you bring to me. Okay? Now, we had begun the Parsha of Matos, the laws of nullification of vows, oaths. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Zeh hadover. Remember, it's the beginning of Matos. So Rashi says, all of the Nevi'im, when they prophesied, they said, Ko Hashem, which indicates it wasn't with absolute clarity. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Zeh Dvar Hashem. It was definitive, because Moshe Rabbeinu's level of clarity, the communication Hashem said with Moshe was an open level of communication. It didn't come through a riddle. It was an awake state. Therefore, that's the differentiation between the voice of Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moshe, and the nevuah of other prophets. Here it says Zeh Dover, and there, by all other prophets, it's Ko Hashem, meaning it indicates there's a certain degree of lack of clarity, meaning the communication is not absolute to them. To Moshe, it was absolute with absolute clarity. Now, what happens at the end of Parshas Matos? The members of the Menashe community come to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, we have a problem. If a daughter inherits the land of the father, if there are no sons, and they're the only heirs, what happens if that woman marries another tribe? And then afterwards, she dies. The son inherits her mother. And how does a child identify with the paternal side, with the paternal line? So if they identify with the maternal line, so that means you're shifting the nachla, the portion of that tribe, into the other tribe. So as a result of that, the no Tzlavchod, now they were single. If they were married now, they'll marry out of the tribe. So our portion becomes lessened. Because their sons will actually, when they die, the sons are the paternal lines of another tribe. They will inherit our portion, and it will shift out of our tribe. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, Zeh Dvar Hashem. This is the Dvar Hashem, Lo Sisiv Nachlo, that the daughters of Tzlavchod are not permitted to marry out of the tribe, because otherwise the Nachla will shift out from the tribe of Menashe to another tribe. They're only permitted to marry within the tribe itself. Right? That was Moshe Rabbeinu's response. That what they're saying is correct. The members of the Menashe tribe, that the daughters of Tzlavchod cannot marry out, because if they marry out, the portion of Menashe will become lessened. Now, how does Moshe Rabbeinu communicate that halacha to Klal Yisrael. Zeh hadover she'amar Hashem. In regard to that, he says zeh hadover. Meaning, it's interesting. So, as at the beginning of the Devarim, zeh hadover she'amar Hashem, it's with that level of definitiveness, of absoluteness, to distinguish between Moshe's Nevuah and all other Nevi'im. When it comes to this law, which pertains to inheritance, also, it's Zeh. Moshe says, Zeh Hadover She'amar Hashem. This is what Hashem says, Zeh. Which means, so although Moshe Rabbeinu was denied the right initially to communicate the laws of inheritance, and it was initiated through the B'no Slavchod, and therefore was Nisal Men Halacha, but ultimately, even regard to the portion of Slavchod, Hashem says to Moshe, Moshe is the ultimate. Because Moshe came back and he said, Zed Var Hashem. Again, to indicate that it's not any other area. Other areas he had this clarity, and he didn't have, even regarding this, Hashem provided him with that clarity, even regard to the inheritance, and specifically the inheritance of a daughter, that you can't shift that portion out from one tribe to another tribe. That's the point they made. Ela Hadvorim. Dvorim Hadvorim, Ela Hadvorim. The word Dvorim, it's alluded to. The word Dvorim is three. Ela Hadvorim is one Dvorim. Then you have Hadvorim, and then without that you have Dvorim. Remez, Romaz, Gimel, Pomim, Nemru. That the Torah was mentioned three times. The Sinai, at Sinai, Hashem had communicated Torah to the Klal Yisrael. Nishlu Bo'el Moed, it was repeated in O'el Moed. V'nishlu Bar Moav, and that's Mishnah Torah, right? Devarim is Mishnah Torah, is repeated in Arvis Moav. V'al kol mitzvah nichsu yudvav brisos b'Sinai. Every mitzvah there was 16 commandments for each mitzvah. Yudvav Bo'el Moed. The Yudvav Arvis Moav was repeated three times, 16 commandments every mitzvah. Shem Menches, which is 48. Listen. So how many commandments are there on the mitzvahs? 48. Uchenegdon Hizir Memches Pomim Bator Al Avodah Zarah. I once mentioned on Chuma. How many times is Avodah Zarah mentioned in the Torah? 48 times. The Hizir Memches Pomim Bator Al Ager. Shebo Lidovik Batorah. Shedichros Memches Brisos. The laws which pertain to a convert are mentioned 48 times in the Torah because he separated himself from idolatry to become part of the Torah, which we entered with 48 commandments. Okay? So I had once said, if you remember, the Medrash Chumah, there's one in Parshas Yisro, when Moshe Rabbeinu had said to Yisro, originally Yisro had said to Moshe, either you come to greet me, or you come out to greet your wife and children, or for your children's sake. Hashem says to Moshe, you go greet Moshe for his sake. Why? Because he abandoned Avodah Zarah, idolatry, to become part of Torah, to become part of the Jewish people. So he's worthy and deserving. You should come out to acknowledge this, to greet him. That's what Hashem said to Moshe. So that Medrash says there that Avodah Zarah is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. Ger is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. So he terminated his relation with idolatry to become part of the Torah. So here he's mentioning there were 48 commandments which we entered in regarding every mitzvah in the Torah, 48. Now, we read in the sixth parak in Pirkei Avos, how many approaches do you have to be able to acquire the Torah in entirety on a proper level? Memches Dvarim Shatorah Nikim Sfehem. The 48 ways which you acquire Torah, which is discussed, which are articulated in the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos. So why is it Memches? Because we have here, Torah, its Ger is mentioned 48. The only way, and the commandments of 48, the only way you're secure Because the ultimate antidote to the Yetzer Hara is what? Is Torah. Barisi Torah Tavli. The Torah is the antidote to the what? To the Yetzer Hara. The ultimate antithesis to Torah, to God, is idolatry. So we find 48 times idolatry is mentioned, 48 times the ger is mentioned. The 48 covenants which lock us in to every mitzvah. So you need the 48. 48, that number is crucial to be able to secure yourself, to be the antithesis and to be the antidote, to be able to go against the Yetzer Hara. That's what we once mentioned. So it's interesting. What I said yesterday was the Levi had no share in the land. How many cities did the Leviim receive? There were 42 Ori Leviim, and there were 6 Ori Miklot. The Ori Miklot were also Ori Leviim. So in total, how many cities did the Leviim receive? 48 cities. Also, what does Levi represent? Levi represents Torah. Torah is synonymous with 48. That's the 48 covenants. That is what? That is the antithesis. That is what guarantees and insulates us from that level of influence of idolatry. That's Levi. Levi is totally removed. Levi is the only tribe in Egypt that did not become idolaters. All the other Jews in Egypt became idolaters because they were subject to the bondage. Levi was not. Okay? So again, that's 40. So they received 48 cities, which corresponds to the 48 ways and the 48 covenants, which is Torah, which means they were the most secure in the Torah itself. So next he says something interesting. The Balaturim, we have 5 Chumoshim. We have Bereshis, we have Shmos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. So he says, if you take, he says, Sof Tevis Bigmach, you take the last letters of Bereshis, Ve'eler, the first words, Vayikra, Vayedaber, and Eler. That's the last word of each word, which each of the Chumash should be given. Sof Tevis Bigmatria, Yoresa, or Yiras. The Gematria is Yiras. Zo Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. To allude that what's Reishis Chochma, the foundation of Chochma is Yiras Hashem. Ubegmatria Torah. And it's the numerical value of Torah. Yeah, there's Yiras and Torah. It's the same gematria. Okay. Now let's see the Ramban. I mentioned the Ramban here is a very fundamental Ramban. It's interesting. The Gemara tells us in Rosh Hashanah, what happens if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos? One does not blow the shofar. Why does one not blow the shofar? So Rabbah says, because there's a concern that if a person is not adept in blowing the shofar, he may transport the shofar in public domain, and it'll be in violation of Shabbos. So it's a rabbinical offense. Shema Yavrin Dalat B'Shus HaRabim. That's why you're not permitted to blow shofar on Shabbos, because the person may come to violate Shabbos by transporting the shofar to go to a person to teach him how to blow the shofar. That's a rabbinic offense. So the question is, if the Torah says you must blow the shofar, how did the rabbi say that you don't blow the shofar? So the Gemara tells us in a number of locations that the rabbis are empowered by the Torah to annul a mitzvah if the way it's annulled is a passive state. You're not proactively violating the Torah, you're just not fulfilling the mitzvah. That's called Yesh Koch Mecham Lach Dov Min Torah B'Shed Al Taseh. If you're in the passive state, they're empowered by the Torah for the sake of offense to legislate this kind of offense. Okay? But how do we know this? The Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah is referred to in Torah as what? as Yom Trua. Yom Trua, it's the day of the Trua, of the blast of the shofar. And yet, the Gemara asks, the Torah refers to Rosh Hashanah as Zichron Trua. It's the remembrance of the blast, which indicates that you don't blow the shofar. Is it the day of the blast of the shofar, or is it only a Zichron? It's a remembrance of the blast. So our answer is no. If it's Rosh Hashanah during the weekday, it's Yom Trua. But if it's on Shabbos, then it's Zichron Trua. Then it's only the remembrance of a blast. You don't blow the shofar. So what's the Torah doing? The Torah is alluding that there's a concern that if you blow the shofar on Shabbos, there's a concern you may transport the shofar on Shabbos. A person who doesn't know how to blow the shofar, without thinking, he may inadvertently transfer the shofar into public domain and be a violation of Shabbos. Therefore, the Torah says, if that's the case, better don't blow the shofar. And don't fulfill the mitzvah, positive command, blowing the shofar. So there's a Ritva, which I always mention. The Ritva, who's the commentator, who's from the earlier commentators, writes, we find this concept known as asmachto. It's a rabbinic interpretation. Based on the Pasuk, it's a rabbinic interpretation. So he says a rabbinic interpretation doesn't mean to say Chazal initially had a concern, and we find something in Torah which is like a mnemonic to remember the rabbinic fence. It goes the other way. The Torah, by stating its case in the context that it mentions it, tells us that there is a concern. There's a concern. And it's up to Chazal, whenever they choose, they should actually legislate in this, because it is concerned, they should legislate a fence. Whenever they feel the time is time to legislate the fence, at that moment they should do it. So it's not they themselves had a concern. Somebody may transport the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, but rather the Torah is alluding to that concern. And whenever they feel that concern has to be addressed, they should institute this fence. It's like a red flag. So Zichron Trua, it's not a Torah law, but the Torah is alluding to you and telling you there's a red flag, there's a concern here, and this area has to be shored up, has to be strengthened. That's the famous Ritva. And the Ritva says, and if a person who does not believe that this is the concept of asmachto, that there's such thing that the Torah alludes to concerns, he uses a very strong term. He says, Ein lo chel b'Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. The person has no share in the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. This is rooted in the understanding of what the Torah is communicating. Okay? That's the Ramban. That's the Ritva. Now, there's an interesting Ramban here in the introduction. The Gemara tells us a number of locations that Kohanim zrizim hang. Kohanim, when they do things with alacrity. They do things with alacrity. We find concepts that Ishvus b'Migdosh. The Migdosh, one doesn't need rabbinic fences. Rabbinic fences, when they legislate them, majority have no application to the Beis Hamikdash. So you could say because it was overseen by the Kohanim, and because Kohanim, there was reason they did everything with alacrity. They never delayed, and they never procrastinated. They addressed it immediately. Therefore, they were always at that level of cognizance. Therefore, Ishvus b'Migdosh. Therefore, there are no rabbinic fences in the Migdosh. Okay? Now, the Ramban says something interesting here. Devarim is called Mishnah Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu reviews the Torah in entirety. The mitzvahs that were mentioned earlier, those mitzvahs are repeated again here. Some others that were never mentioned before. But the ones that were mentioned previously are repeated. But there's certain mitzvahs are not repeated. Which one? Which mitzvahs are not repeated? Torah's Kahanim. The laws which pertain to Kohanim are not repeated. So Ramban says, why? Why doesn't the Torah repeat Torah's Kahanim? So Ramban says the reason why the Torah feels it's not necessary to repeat it, because Kohanim is rizimim. Because Kohanim, they do things with alacrity, and there's no procrastination. They're always cognizant of their obligation. Therefore, it's not necessary to repeat. People who have short memories, who get distracted, you have to repeat. The Kohanim who don't forget, and they're not distracted from their responsibilities, you don't have to repeat. So when Chazal say Kohanim's reason, it's the evaluation of Chazal. it's inferred from the Torah. Since we find in Mishnah Torah that Torah's Kanim is not repeated, as all other mitzvahs are repeated, that indicates it's not necessary to repeat it. Why is it not necessary to repeat? The answer is because Kohanim's reason, because Kohanim do everything with alacrity and without any level of hesitation or procrastination. Therefore, it's not necessary to repeat it whatsoever. Who lived in Vinsk? Vinsk was a city in Latvia. One was Rebbeir Simcha Vinsk. That was the Or Sameach. And there was the famous Rogatchover going, the Rogatchover. His name was Rav Yosef Rosen. He lived in Vinsk. And a person had come to ask a very complicated question about mikvah, how to build a mikvah. And they lived right across the street from one another. The Rogatchover going and Rebbeir Simcha of Vinsk. So first the person goes into Rebbeir Simcha of Vinsk. His name was Meir Simcha Cohen. He was a Cohen. The Or Sameach, and he poses the question. So he says to him, "Come back in 20 minutes, and I'll give you exactly the solution to how to build the mikvah, and what you have to be concerned about, what you don't have to be concerned about. Come back in 20 minutes." He figures while he's waiting 20 minutes, he'll go across the street and ask the Rogatchover the question. Goes to Rogatchover. Before he gets the words out of his mouth, the Rogatchover instantaneously gives him how to build the mikvah, and he has it clear. He finishes with Rogatchover in 5 minutes, goes across the street back to the Or Sameach, and the Or Sameach tells him the exact same thing verbatim. So this person had a little bit of chutzpah, and he says to Or Sameach, "I come to you, ask the shayla, ask the question. You tell me to come back in 20 minutes. I go to Rogatchover. I ask the question. Before I get the question out of my mouth, he's already answering the question. Why did you need the 20 minutes? The Rogatchover didn't need the 20 minutes." That's what this person asked Or Sameach. So Or Sameach answers. He says, "I want to explain you something. The Rogatchover going, the whole concept of forgetting has no relevance. Then why? Because the Rogatchover going reviews the Torah its entirety every 30 days. That's his level of involvement. There's no lapse, so the concept of forgetting has no relevance to him. Me, I don't review it as often, every 30 days. So for me, I have relevance that I have lapses. So because I have lapses, I need a little more time. That's what he said. But the Rogatchover going, which every 30 days reviews the Torah in entirety, that's Tanakh, Bavli, Ushalmi, everything. For him, the whole concept of forgetting, there's not a moment of lapse, therefore he could answer you immediately. The Kohanim Lavdil, where Kohanim's reasoning, the level of alacrity, the level of cognizance was at such a level, there was never a moment they actually were not fully invested in what they were supposed to be invested in. As a result of that, the concept of fence is always, of course, there's a distraction, there's a blind spot. For them, we don't have to make fences for their blind spots which pertain to their laws. This says, if somebody asks you any question in Torah, don't stammer. You should answer with immediacy. It should be so embedded in your mind, and your level should have such a level of clarity. If anybody asks you any halacha question, with immediately you should respond. Al tegamgem, the word gam, don't stammer. You start hesitating and stammering, and then you give the answer. With immediacy, you should give it. What does that mean? It's the concept. If a person will be fully invested in Torah, and his mind is only occupied with that, then we could talk about anybody asks you any halacha question, al tegamgem. The person doesn't stammer. But if you have distractions and you're not invested at that level, then there's gimgum, then one stammers. I got to check it out. I got to think about it. You hesitate, you pause, rather than giving the answer immediately. But that's the ultimate level, al tegamgem. Now, there's a sefer that was printed after Rav Chaim Kanevsky passed away. At least I surveyed it, printed towards the end of his life. It's called Torah Min HaShamayim. Torah Min HaShamayim. It was known, Rav Chaim Kanevsky had Ruach HaKodesh. He was divinely inspired. And he would say to people ask him literally, he answered every single day at least 100 letters, questions in halacha. People used to write him letters, and he would spend every day over 100 responses. Some response was one line, permitted, not permitted, a source, whatever it is. At least 100 letters a day he would send out. And he had his day regimented such a way. Rav Chaim didn't say, bring me this sefer or that sefer. Everything was what came to mind. And he used to say to the people, whatever comes out of my mind is what Hashem puts in my mind. I mean, he reviewed the Torah's entirety every year, Rav Chaim Kanevsky, but he said, it's called Torah ben Hashamayim. Whatever comes to my mind, that's what I say. So he could say two people will come and ask a certain piece of advice. He could tell them the same question. One person would give one piece of advice, the other person give a different piece of advice. Why? Because that's what came to his mind. Because that was the Ruach HaKodesh he had. But it's only because he was so involved in Torah, he's so imbued that he hadn't literally, if you read his schedule, what he learned every day, it's not to be believed. How much material he reviewed every day. He would make a scene on Bavli, Yerushalmi, Zohar, everything. Once a year before Pesach, Fasim B'chorim, he finished the whole Torah its entirety. Make a siyum. This famous story, somebody came for a bracha, they weren't well, and he had just made a siyum, not sure on what. Whenever he'd make a siyum, he would say a glass of wine to celebrate the siyum. So this person came by to Rav Chaim Kanevsky a number of years ago. I think it was cancer. He had cancer. And Rav Chaim says, he gave him a bracha, you drink this wine. It'll be good. And the person that had no idea what that wine was. School of drink wine. People, they bless the wine. Afterwards, all of a sudden, he goes to the doctor. They do the scan. No trace of cancer. So he comes back to Reb Chaim and says, what was that wine? He says, that wine, I finished Seder Bavli. So that Bar Perkofen I said was on Seder Bavli. When I finished Bavli, that's what that wine was. You understand? It wasn't just an ordinary cup of wine. It wasn't just an ordinary siyum. It was Reb Chaim Kanevsky siyum on Bavli. That's what it was. But Rav Chaim HaKodesh explains, there's a famous word from Rav Chaim Volozhino. They asked Rav Chaim Volozhino, what is the next location where the Jewish people are going to be becoming Mashiach? So he said, North America. Why? Because if you follow the migrations of Jews in history, the Jews were not in North America yet. They weren't there. And in Yiddish, when students studied in yeshiva in Europe, they had no dormitories. So the residence of the student, he would rent a room, and in Yiddish it was called a shtanzia. That was the word they used. The shtanzia means the last stop. So he says the last stop of the Jewish people is North America, mainly the United States. Why? Because he says since the Jewish people, a concentration of Jews who have never been there, there's certain nitzotze kedusha, there's certain neshamos, there's certain sparks of holiness. It's like a minesweeper. The Jewish people have to be there to extract whatever kedusha is there, and once they finish extracting kedusha from that location, then Mashiach will come. That's what it's all about. Therefore, he says the last stopover is North America, mainly the United States. So Rav Chaim HaKodesh explains that every location in the desert that we stopped, there were certain sparks of holiness there. We had to extract whatever holiness was in that desert, so only Hashem knew. Therefore, he says, travel here, you stay there 2 weeks a day, then you go on. Because the Jewish people themselves were like a magnetic force to extract whatever Kedusha there was in the location. We were able to extract that Kedusha from that location. You find there's certain locations in the world where the majority of Jewish people were there, like Bavel, right? Bavel, the majority of Jews were in Bavel, were in Iraq, that part of the world at one time. Afterwards, versus the past, very insignificant numbers. The Jews during World War II went to the Far East. Were there for what, 5 years? After the war, how many Jews are there in Shanghai or any of these locations? Because once we leave, we don't go back there. It's not Poland. We were in Poland for 1,000 years. The Jewish people. The Nazis, Yimach Shmam, it was Judenrein. Germany and Poland were basically Judenrein. They cleansed it from Jews. Again, that's the same idea. Okay, no.